Don't forget, you can always speed me up or slow me down by going to our YouTube link. And in the bottom right-hand corner, there is a gear symbol. Click on that and you can change my speed to either make me go faster or slower. Welcome to Gross Neuroanatomy and the function of brain structures. This is just a really fancy way of saying we're going to talk about the brain and some of the parts of the brain that make up how our brain functions and what each of these different parts do. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about in this particular section. In my courses, you have two different slide versions. One is going to look similar to what you see in this podcast lecture. The other one is going to show an image and then have blanks where you can label the images. Depending upon your class, I do it different for different classes, you might have images that you are going to label for the next exam. Okay, so talk to me about that. If your exam has labeling on it, these slides are going to be super helpful in terms of you making sure that you know what each of the different brain structures are, where they're located, what they look like, so that you can then go ahead and label them for the exam. Okay. The other thing I want to touch on before we dive into the brain is for those of you who have taken a lot of science classes, maybe you've taken anatomy and physiology, if that's the case, this is going to be a beautiful little walk for you. What I like to tell people is that this is psychology biology. This is not your A&P class. We are not going to dig into all the tiny little elements that make up the brain because we have a week or two. And so we are going really high level when it comes to the brain and eventually the neurons. So with that, if you are a science fanatic, this should be a review for you. For those of you who are really intimidated by science and the term A&P just makes your skin crawl, hang in there. I'm going to walk you through this. I'm going to give you weird ways to remember these things to help make it palatable. My goal is that you understand how the brain functions. So we have this amazing thing in everybody's head. Everybody has this thing in their head, and it functions so beautifully. And so I want you to figure out, how does this thing function? What are the different parts? What are the different, we're going to talk about lobes. And then eventually we're going to talk about the neurons too. So how do the brain and the neurons, how do they work together to make our body do what it does? So it's fascinating. I'll try to make it palatable for you, for those of you who don't like the hard science side of things. So bear with me. And with that, we are going to dive in and talk about, if my slide will advance, there we go. We're going to talk about the points of view. So on your screen, there is a brain, okay? This brain is being cut in 3 different directions. So we have a blue plane, a yellow plane, and kind of, I guess it's a red plane. It kind of looks orange, but it's red. Okay, so we're going to cut the brain in 3 different ways. And the point of this is, as we move forward, you're going to see some different brain images. And if you don't know how the brain is being cut, you're not going to understand what view of the brain you're looking at. So are you looking at it from the front? Are you looking at it from the top? So that's what this is, the points of view of the brain. And so we're going to start with the blue one. The blue plane is slicing into the brain, and for a moment, this is going to feel weird, but bear with me. Take your hand and using your head as a model, how are we slicing the brain? Is it between your eyes? Is it through your ears? What does that look like? And for this one, I'll give you the answer. We're going between the eyes so that we have, not on the nose, between the eyes. Imagine we're cutting the eyeballs in half almost, so that we have a top portion of the brain and a bottom portion of the brain. Okay, so we're going to take that sliced plane right where we cut it, and we're going to open up the brain. And what you see in that blue slide down at the bottom of the screen is the bottom portion, or sometimes you'll see the top portion of that slice. Okay. The next one, the yellow one, take your hand again, and how are we cutting your brain according to the yellow slice? And this one we're going to take and we're going to cut as if you're cutting through the nose so that your eyeballs are on either side of this plane. Okay, so you have a right side and you have a left side. I love this view of the brain. There's so many things that you can see here, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. The red one, take your hand. How are we going to cut your brain according to this red plane? And this one is going through the ears almost. That's how we're going to describe it for psychology, biology. We're going to go as if you're going through the ears so that you have a front portion of the brain and a back portion of the brain. Okay, so take a look at those and see if you can visualize how these are being sliced through the eyeballs, between the eyeballs, and through the ear, again, just roughly speaking, so that you can see the different cuts as we look at brains. We're going to start with the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the outermost wrinkly portion of the brain. So if we were to take a cadaver and we took the skull off of the cadaver, okay? Cadaver, dead body. So if we took the skull off of this cadaver, this would be what we see first, the cerebral cortex. It's the wrinkly part of the brain. It's the outermost portion of the brain. I'm going to give you a hint. It is not color-coded. It is just very fleshy, pinky, grayish color. And so we don't see all of these beautiful color codings like you see on the screen. We're going to dive into the different lobes of the cerebral cortex. And lobes simply mean that we're going to divide the outermost wrinkly portion of the brain into 4 different pieces or 4 different chunks. We call them different lobes. So this pink one is the frontal lobe. It is in charge of planning and movement. So if you take your hand and you put it on your forehead, that is your frontal lobe. Okay, again, this is very roughly speaking. That is your frontal lobe. That's planning and movement. I always think of Pooh Bear. Pooh Bear is always saying, think, 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 think. And so he kind of like bounces his hand on his frontal lobe. And so that's my silly way of remembering the frontal lobe. It's planning, and then we add in movement as well. This bluish grayish hue, it looks blue on one side, gray on the other. This is called the parietal lobe. Parietal. You can say that a couple times if you need to. Parietal. This is in charge of touch, heat, and sensory input. So your senses, your how do I want to say it? The heat, not your body heat, but being able to feel heat. Okay, so touch. If you were to take your hand and put it on top of your head and then move it back just a little bit, that is where your parietal lobe is located. So kind of like a hat. So you wear a hat in order to help keep your body warm, which I just told you it's not that kind of heat, but it's a weird way to remember. Touch, heat, sensory input. You put a hat on top of your head, so therefore this is on the top portion of your head. All right, green, we're going to look at the temporal lobe. Temporal helps you with hearing. Conveniently, if you touch on your head in this location, so where the green portion lies, you're going to touch on 2 different areas. And again, roughly speaking, you're going to touch on your temple, temporal, temple. Isn't that nice? And it's right next to your ears, which helps you with hearing. Okay, isn't that great? So temporal lobe helps you with hearing. And then the red is way on the back side of the brain. This is the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe helps us with vision. And the weird way to remember this, if your mama ever said that she has eyes in the back of her head, maybe it was a teacher, that is the occipital lobe. So the eyes in the back of the head. All right, we're going to take a look at two different wrinkles in specific. Right here, I just circled very roughly. This is called the motor cortex. And if you look at the other image here, it's this wrinkle right here. It is the division line between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And the motor cortex is on the frontal lobe portion. So when we look at this, the frontal lobe is in charge of planning and movement. So what do you think the motor cortex is going to be in charge of? Movement. You got it. Pretty simple there. We're going to look right behind that at the wrinkle on the parietal lobe side. So if you notice here, this wrinkle on both of these images, you can always kind of see this beautiful little division line that separates the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So this is on the back side, on the parietal lobe side. We call this the somatosensory cortex. Sometimes people shorten it to the sensory cortex. It all means the same thing. This somatosensory cortex is in charge of your main sensory input. So seeing, hearing, which also goes with the temporal lobe, tasting. Okay, so some of those, we're going to dive into that in just a second, so I don't want to ruin it too much. But the somatosensory cortex is going to help us with some of our senses, our sensory input. All right, somatosensory and motor homonucleus. It is organized such that there is more cortex, or more of the wrinkly brain area, dedicated to senses of the skin for particular areas of the body. So somatosensory cortex is in charge of what again? It's in charge of your sensory input, with some exceptions. So here, the more, as you look at this image, if you look at this face right here, the larger it is, the more brain area it's going to take up in the somatosensory portion of your brain. And this is just a silly drawing to represent it. The hand is not literally right here. It all kind of works together. But the larger it is on here, the more cortex is dedicated to that particular sense. Kind of cool. We're going to shift over to the motor side of things. Motor cortex is also organized such that there is more cortex dedicated to control of the muscles for particular areas of the body. So if we have more cortex dedicated to a certain part of the body, we're going to be able to control it more, right? Just like back here, more cortex means that it has more sensation information. Okay, so if we look, I jump back to the sensory piece. So if we look at the somatosensory portion, your face and your hands have a lot of cortex for those particular areas. So if you touch on your face, it has a lot of sensation information, and the same with your hands. You can look at all the different pieces on there. We're going to shift back over to the motor cortex, and the same idea here. The more cortex dedicated to particular portions of your body is going to give you more in terms of in terms of motor control. So if you look again, the face is really large on this image, and that's because you can move your face around in lots of different ways. So play with your face for a minute. You have a lot of motor control over your face. Your fingers have a lot of motor control. You can see different other parts of your body, your toes, your feet, your tongue, swallowing. So it's kind of interesting. If we take both of these, this motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, and we put them together in order to create a being, this is what the being would look like. So you can see very large hands because we have great senses that come through our hands and great motor movement as well. I love the ears that are going on here. That's fabulous. We have some lips that are huge, and we have a tongue, which is ginormous. So you can see how the senses and the motor, if we would put them together, this is what a being would look like based upon the distribution of our motor and somatosensory cortex. Just kind of fun.